Welcome everybody to the IIC's Italy chapter webinar on regulating digital markets. My thanks to the chair of the IIC's Italy chapter, Dr. Augusto Preta, and the members of the chapter, Commissioner Giomi of AGCOM, Professor Nicita, and Dr. Manganelli for putting this meeting together on a timely and topical subject. We're looking forward to hearing from such excellent speakers this afternoon. For those of you in the audience who are new to the International Institute of Communications, the IIC is the only independent international forum that brings together statutory national regulators, global commercial operators, and end-user representatives in a neutral and trusted environment to discuss policy issues. The IIC's core purpose is to inform and thereby shape the global public policy agenda for the digital society and economy. And we do this through our programme of regional and international regulator forums, telecommunications and media forums, the annual conference, and our chapters located around the globe. This wide variety of forums enables us to focus on a programme of meetings and events at a domestic, regional and international level. For those of you who attended the IIC's Brussels Telecommunications and Media Forum in March, where we discussed the Digital Markets Act, this chapter meeting follows on nicely from those panel sessions. So therefore, I am delighted to introduce our chapter chair, Dr. Augusto Preta. Over to you, Augusto.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you also for the great job that the IIC London made and the great support for this meeting. Thank you very much. I'm really delighted and honored to host as president of the chapter this important webinar today, which is attended by an impressive number of people around the world. Since I guess I'm not the main reason for this result, I will go quickly forward to my short welcome. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here, speakers and participants, stressing the importance for the Italian chapter of today's webinar. It's a premiere, which means that it's our first meeting event in 2022. As a premiere, therefore, we wanted to start in the most attractive way, and I guess we did, presenting such an impressive panel of speakers, which I'm sure will make this webinar a truly remarkable event. Second, as you may know, we are thanks to this book, Regulating Digital Market, written by two IIC members and friends, the two Antonios, Antonio Manganelli and Antonio Nicita, involved in a series that seems to be only at its second episode after we presented in a similar occasion last year the previous book on telecommunication market. I look forward for the third episode next year. The chapter will continue to follow and support the fortune of our two heroes. Third, we are discussing today is very dear to me and most important to the IIC, how to regulate digital markets. At the IIC, we truly believe there is a significant role to play for the Institute, also in the EU policy debate, as well as in many other jurisdictions, where there is a need for an open, honest, multidisciplinary dialogue that a global independent organization such as the IIC can afford better than anyone else. Therefore, before giving the floor to the following speaker, just allow me to spend a few words on this subject, and in particular, one chapter of the book I really enjoy, maybe because I'm more familiar with, relating to the digital platform and market power. In a nutshell, also, as well described in the book, in a classic way to interpret antitrust rules, we have two conflicting concepts: competition in the market, competition for the market. In the former case, the idea is that due economy of scale and scope, direct and indirect network effects, and consumer behavior bias, digital markets are subject to tipping, which means the dominant play, the digital platform, impulsing a strategy where winner takes all, therefore strongly reduces competition and consumer welfare. The latter case, on the contrary, moving from static to dynamic competition, contends that dominance over listing relevant markets rather than tipping might in some cases even increase consumer welfare and thus still require the use of the antitrust criteria to assess platform market power, which means basically a case-by-case post-market analysis. But what is really happening and overcomes the traditional opposing views, as the two authors clearly explain in the book, is that big platforms are not just competing from the market. They envisage a new institutional order, the digital ecosystem, in which they actually compete through envelopment strategy to become the market. In this new framework, the new regulatory approach of the EU, in particular the TSA and the EMA we are discussing today, raises first a simple question to me. If this is how the digital market works, why have we waited so long to realize it and intervene? First of all, maybe because the beneficial effect of platform economy on social welfare. These positive externalities were a strong deterrent to invasive regulation of the sector at the beginning, and at the same time made more difficult to envisage a dedicated regulation for the big platform different from traditional market players to match and adapt to this new digital environment. In this way, or only in recent years, a strong debate has started in Europe as well as in the rest of the world on the critical factors and the risks related to pervasive role of online platforms as intermediaries or properly gatekeepers in the Commission definition between business and citizen. As a consequence, a two-step approach took place. At first, to regulate the online platform indirectly through data regulation. Then, in the second phase now in place, through an horizontal approach such as the EU Digital Package. I believe all this process will be discussed and explored in detail today, including the difference among the different pieces of regulation and enforcement, with the aim of giving a broad, concrete and up-to-date picture of the state of the art and future development of the digital market regulation in Europe. On this regard, my sincere congratulations go to Antonio Manganelli and Antonio Nicita. Thanks, guys, for your stimulating book and for giving us the opportunity to involve in this exciting exercise such a remarkable speaker. Roberto Viola, in primis, a great friend of the IIC, who I personally want to thank to be here today once again. I will, of course, follow with the great attention and interest this important webinar I'm honored to host, also from a further composite motivation and involvement in the same way expressed by the two authors in the preface to the book. As scholar, as father, as civil servant, if my add, as EU citizen. All that being said, Roberto, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, really, Augusto, for the invitation, for having defined me a friend of the IIC, which I really feel to be, and I'm very honored to open this workshop. And also, I want as well to congratulate the authors of the book, the two Antonios, for their very, very sharp analysis of the evolution of regulation. And I must say, there are many books that are flourishing around digital markets and how to regulate. But before writing a book, you should understand. I mean, and that's the beauty of this book. It really shows the two authors understand what we are talking about. And let me start from this. I think the reasons to regulate, as you said, must be linked somehow to the fact that market forces do not function well. And that's why it's a good question to start our discussion, why we have not intervened before. I always say that regulation should be a little bit lazy. I mean, should not be anticipating, market evolution, but should follow market evolution. Of course, there's a price to pay when you do that, because then you chase, you fix, you try to address. But there are really few cases where I see the potential role of preventive regulation in order to address and shape the market. Perhaps an exception is the artificial intelligence, where indeed we have been a bit ahead of the curve, proposing a regulation, while still the beauties and the usefulness of AI is unfolding in the society. But there, because the purpose of that regulation is really to mitigate the risks and actually to make sure that the adoption is as quickly as possible. Now, in the area of commercial platforms, the adoption has been booming because it follows the famous network effect. And regulators have been a bit lazy. As I said, structurally they have to be lazy, but maybe we have been waiting a bit too much. And that's a particular area where things could have evolved a bit more quickly in terms of regulatory intervention, which is the area of algorithmic amplification. And well, actually they are linked but slightly different. On one side, algorithmic amplification, which is very much a DSA issue, and gatekeeping, which is very much a DMA issue. These two single issues have created, frankly, a certain degree of damage in the society. Algorithmic amplification created and amplified forms of populism we would not have probably seen in the society, and also has given to some certain state actor, which have not really good intention towards democracy, the weapon to actually attack democracy. Of course, these are intended consequences from the platform side, but they are real consequences that we feel every day in our society. The other element, which is, as I said, something we try to address in the DMA, is the gatekeeping function of this platform. Gatekeeping, in terms of, essential facilities is absolutely a known subject, normally referred to in the area, for instance, staying with digital of telecom, where, of course, whoever has a dominant position in the access is a bit of a bottleneck. In platform economy, this concept of gatekeeping has been very much debated, discussed. You all know, the theory about it. There was never, let's say, an acceleration in terms of convergent thinking, but the pressure on the legislator regulators was mounting because the number of cases in which this power was exercised, abusing of a dominant position, which have been, clearly testified by the various antitrust cases in Europe and in the world, by the evident effect on restraining innovation and other possibilities for companies that depend to do business from this gatekeeper. Now, the evidence was so massive that clearly we arrived at talking about tipping point, to the tipping point where ex-ante regulation is necessary. So this has been the kind of turning point in the regulation history at the moment that, the two co-legislators, on the basis of the proposal of the Commission, decided that, it was the time to have ex-ante measures when it comes to regulation of large platforms. Now we can continue debate forever. Is it the right moment? There was better a bit before, but maybe this is again for the historians or people that like to tell about how the history of regulation unfolds. Now, for us, looking at the EU institution, in particular the Commission, now it's time to organize for the enforcement of DSA and DMA rules. And on this, allow me to broaden a little bit the picture on governance of rules, because the title of this workshop, it's a bit broader than DSA, DMA, although I understand it focuses quite quickly on these two. So in Europe, we have two models of governance. A more horizontal one that allows us to in a very cooperative way, to set up a converging regulatory model. This is the model we use in telecom. And the reason why we use this model is that, I mean, not that this is a particular virtue, but historically, telecom markets are national markets. Efforts to make those markets a bit more cross-border so far are not that successful compared to other markets. So in a way, the reflex of, I mean, getting the regulators together and working horizontal together, it seems to be the option of choice. Then we have another type of regulation for the internal EU market, which is the one about services which follow the country of origin rule. For instance, the audiovisual services. They are from a country you can address all of Europe. And they are, again, I mean, historically, we have been oscillating from, let's say, almost a very light regulation, not really attributable to, I mean, that's especially with the new AVMSD directive, a system based on independent regulator and on a kind of a light model still, which is the ERGA today. Then our intention is to make ERGA stronger, especially looking at our next steps in legislation. But that's the way, I mean, audiovisual markets have been organized. Then it comes to platform. Now, those two models, none of the two would work very well for platforms. Platforms tend to be, I mean, cross-border by nature. They exploit network effects, economies of scope and scale. So the only real level for regulation, it's the European one, if not, I mean, the world one. Any attempt to kind of cut the problem in national markets, it's bound to fail. And it's interesting, I mean, the DMA, from the very beginning, our proposal was a European regulation model, well understood in cooperation with the national authorities, especially the competition authorities for the DMA, but not only. And for the TSA, the original proposal of the Commission, again, for the historians of EU regulation, this is rather unique what happened, was the horizontal model. But by creating kind of, I mean, aggregator regulators in each country, what we call the digital service coordinators, so that would aggregate different regulators under the same umbrella. And then the European Council, the Council with the support of the Parliament, changed the model to actually a model by which for very large platforms, the Commission is in charge. So that's, I say, it's rather unique because normally when we propose something about, I mean, the internal market, the Council tries to keep the national prerogatives. Here has been exactly the opposite. And the reason is that, I mean, the equilibrium between the country of origin and country of destination, which is very much the rule we follow in country of origin rule for e-commerce activities in Europe, could not easily be found. Because if you go towards the country of destination, you would destroy the beauty of the internal market, which is from a single address in Europe, you address the whole internal market. If you go towards the country of origin, you would alienate the rights of country of destination on things like content, which flows on a platform, to actually have a say into the regulatory model. That's why, I mean, in a way, the only practical solution was to give the regulation in the hands of the European Commission. And this was the final decision. So now we have basically to reconcile these different models. We will have a model for DSA DMA, which is European based with the cooperation of national regulators, a model for telecom, which is relatively horizontally distributed, a model for content, which today it's very similar to telecom, but has more potential to converge to a more European model than in the case of telecom. So these are, let's say, the four models that are around. Then there are emerging issues like, for instance, data, where we have proposed the Data Innovation Board for the Data Governance Act and Data Act, which again is a bit of an horizontal model, but with more, let's say, European kind of sense of direction. And there's an open debate, really open, for what is the right model for artificial intelligence. Where many from the Parliament side, but not only, also from the Council, so European member states, are thinking in the direction of a model similar to DSA and DMA, which then raises another question, which is the European Commission equipped to do the regulator, I mean, for the markets, because the European Commission traditionally has a role of a legislator, has a role in secondary legislation, as a political, clearly an addressing role in terms of policy, but except from competition policy, rarely enforces directly rules. So in this case, clearly, this will be the case. And that means that, I mean, the concerned structures inside the Commission, they need to get organized. That's what we are doing right now, to actually enforce DSA and DMA. DMA will be very much an enforcement that we will do together with DG Competition. For those of you that are familiar with the telecom, at the beginning of the telecom rules, there was an agreement between, at that time, DG INFSO and DG Competition to work together in enforcing what is the Article 7, so-called Article 7 procedure, which is basically the notification of markets and comments and all this. In DMA, we will do the same. We will create, we have done the proposal jointly, and we will create jointly a joint team that will enforce the DMA. DSA will be mainly handled by DG Connect. And DSA has another peculiarity, which is for DSA, the Commission can levy a fee for the enforcement, a little bit like what happens already for financial markets regulators in Europe, and what happens at national level in telecom and media market. This clearly will help enormously in having resources to actually have a structure which will be solid, and we are actually already looking at recruitment of the best minds when it comes to understanding algorithms. And also we will use the cooperation with our in-house research arm like JRC and others to also have the best scientists working on algorithmic transparency. Because when it comes to DSA, it will be very important, the audit process, which is foreseen by the DSA, and the criteria and the verification of the audit, which requires specific expertise. So that's the way we are preparing for this. We don't have much time, because if things go well in terms of voting, the two DSA and DMA will be before the end of the year in the official journal, and then the clock will start ticking. So the first phase for both will be, I mean, the identification of gatekeepers on DMA and very large platforms on DSA. And then from that moment on, then from the identification for DMA, certain obligation will automatically kick in. Others are subject to a regulatory dialogue, but certain basic obligation will kick in. And there's a reason for it. Again, linked to the question of Augusto about the timing. The reason is that we wanted a system which is agile, and then from, let's say, day one of the regulation already delivers result. Because this system is an ex-ante system, it's completely different from competition law. So in this case, I mean, it's important that the rules are enforceable and effective from day one, and which is the case of the so-called self-executing obligations of DMA. Another interesting race against the clock is the interoperability of services, which is an obligation at the DMA. And there, in the first year, we will have to look at the interoperability of messaging services, and then go, say, by increasing complexity, and look at the interoperability then of video and voice services. To conclude, there's not one size fits all when it comes to regulatory models in digital markets. It's important that first you understand well what kind of problem you have to solve, and then find, I mean, the right reflex and right solution. Clearly, I mean, DSA, DMA enforcement will be quite an interesting journey in terms of learning on the job, so to say. But in doing so, in both cases, we will not completely abandon the horizontal cooperative system, because both systems then rely on the cooperation with the national regulators in a very, I mean, I would say in a team spirit. Because, for instance, DMA as a kind of dissuasor, the rule to dissuade, I mean, national regulators to take their own initiative in matters regulated by the DMA, which means, I mean, we will have to play, I mean, together in 27, and normally 27 is better to 11 than 11. I mean, making a comparison with football. I'm very confident that we will quickly set up all what is needed to actually make sure that the DSA and DMA can be enforced. You will see the Commission speaking less and less and doing more and more. That's why this workshop is a good occasion at the beginning to say a few things, but then you will see me saying less and less and doing more. But this does not stop experts, stakeholders to continue debating. There's one thing I discovered, and I think you probably made the same experience, is that stakeholders are not that aware of what are the important possibilities that the DSA, DMA give to them in terms of getting their rights, I mean, well respected in the platform world. And so it's important that we continue this kind of activity by, I mean, writing good books like the one of the two Antonios, this workshop and the rest, because the more knowledge there is about this instrument, the better the enforcement will be. Many thanks for your attention.
So thank you very much to Roberto for this very interesting summing up, and I totally agree that we need to go through all the details now on DMA and DSA. And what is very important that has been also mentioned by Roberto is the reference to sort of international wave towards imitating DMA and DSA. Anyway, I'm giving the floor now to Antonio Manganelli, that is co-author and is many things behind that and beside that, and it will summing up some of the issues related to the panel that we will have later on. Antonio.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Antonio, and thank you very much, Roberto, for your comprehensive, very interesting intervention, and thank you also for your support and appreciation. I would like also to thank Augusto and Lynn for hosting this webinar, which is, as was anticipated, that was described, is revolving around a book that Antonio Nicita and I has recently published, which I have to show you because there is some good advertising corner, or maybe self-preferencing corner, and maybe
you show just one line, yeah. But it's okay.
Maybe
okay.
This one, okay.
For advertising, no, it's enough.
It's enough, so you can recognize it, the self-preferencing corner. And the thing I wanted to start just from the subtitle of the book, which is the title is Regulating Digital Markets, and the subtitle is the European approach. And the secondary title meaning is twofold, because of course our book outlines the European approach to digital market regulation, in the sense that we mainly examine EU law and EU policy. But in addition, the European approach also underlines the fact that the European policymakers, as far as digital markets are concerned, are still approaching a systemic policy design, which is also has not been completely achieved yet. Although the EU has developed digital policy for more than a decade, only recently with approval of Digital Service Act, Digital Market Act, and then EI regulation, we are going to Europe is going to pose the fundamental cornerstones in the regulation of digital market. And I would like to say a few words on the reason, which was also mentioned by both Augusto and Roberto, on the reason for which it did not develop rules or regulation before let's say than today. And the reason are different. There are different rationales. So there was for sure an institutional rationale in the sense of sometimes limited regulatory capacity, especially at national level, which hinges upon two main elements related to the relationship between public bodies, especially national public bodies, and digital platforms. First of all, there was a huge information asymmetry due to the continuous and fast technological innovation that causes public bodies often to lag behind in terms of understanding of digital market dynamics, a platform internal technical functioning. So platform and algorithms were seen as black boxes from the perspective of most policymakers, especially at national level and especially in the past. And then the other asymmetry is usually the institutional design of public policy making, which is traditionally set and implemented at national level, while digital platforms or more generally digital actors have a global nature. So it was and it is quite difficult for regulators and policymakers, especially at national level, to both obtain information from digital platform and also to effectively design and enforce a regulatory framework which at the end is applicable only to a subset of platform action or platform users. So of course the regulatory instrument and tools which are available to national policy makers and national regulators are were not so important and maybe sufficient. Another rationale is, let's say, what we call in the book a philosophical rationale, meaning that a significant part of the public opinion saw, and to a certain extent still sees, the internet and the web as a place of individual freedom to be preserved under all circumstances, and therefore not to be subject to external public rules. However, of course, this romantic vision proved to very defective as long as the web governance completely changed in the course of the last 3 decades, from a web composed of atomistic and decentralized actors to a strongly centralized system where the virtual networks and community are centrally governed by the large global web actors. So it was clear that the alternative was no more between rules or no rules in the digital ecosystem and the internet environment, but the choice was between public rules and private rules. And the last point, of course, is the economic rationale. The economic rationale, and it's something also Roberto mentioned, of course, there's always the risk in a very innovative market that a too early or an unbalanced or a too stringent regulation could hinder innovation. And of course, it's something that still is something that we have to be careful of, because of course nobody wants to restrain or anyway hinder the innovation pace of the digital ecosystem. And also there is what in the book we call like the digital platforms efficiency dilemma, that is of course there is a characteristic of the markets for which algorithmic price discrimination based on big data is at the base of a double paradox, let's say, which also created the problem for competition law enforcement. On one side, consumer satisfaction in terms of preferences matching a better allocation of time comes along with a reduction of consumer surplus, which under an economic perspective is quite strange. And on the other side, the other strange thing of the digital platforms, of course, which are explainable, but comparing with the traditional market is quite a paradox. On the other side, an efficient allocation of resources, like it usually digital platforms allow, like imperfectly competitive market, comes along with consumer being often screened from competition, as the consumer choice is increasingly restricted in a market segment where there is a gatekeeper. So this economic characteristic of digital markets also made it more difficult to design and to think also a regulatory framework could be able to address the market problem, but without increasing the risk to hinder innovation. Of course, competition law played an important role because as it usually happens in evolving market context, competition law enforcement took the lead on the public intervention, mainly because the enforcement flexibility and ability to adapt to new market circumstances. Of course, because competition law, it's an horizontal piece of rules which can be adapted to different to all different markets. Of course, at a certain point, as was said before, there was the need emerged clearly the need for an ex-ante regulatory framework. And now I will give the floor back to Antonio, which will introduce the older speaker. And the point is that from the competition law perspective, we will have a perspective of how the new regulation, the DMA regulation, will interact with why there was the need of an ex-ante regulation complementing competition law, and what would be the interrelationship between, on one side, DMA regulation and competition law, and also on the other side of DMA and other pieces of legislation which are in a way which can interact in a way with DMA, like, for example, the electronic communication framework. And finally, also the relationship, of course, between the competition aspect in digital markets and also the pluralism aspect that are very important as well in the digital market. So I'll give the floor back to Antonio, which will give the floor then to all the panelists.
Thank you, Antonio. So now we have a discussion panel, and that is organized with an idea of having almost like 10 minutes to each of our panelists, that I thank very much for being here with us. And I also invite the audience that is really large today. If they have any question during this panel, just to write down the questions, and then we will have the panelists that can also look at the questions, because then we will have just a second brief round, almost 5 minutes each, in which I will raise some issues, but in which panelists can also reply to what they heard. Our panel is quite rich, and it has been thought trying to put together the two different areas, which is the areas of competition, or strict competition, antitrust on the one side, and the area of regulation on the other. It was very interesting, actually, was Roberto Viola said, when he reminded us the evolution of telecommunications with the InfoSoc at that point, and how they reacted together with DG Comp in pushing together the design of regulated markets. So it was a really interesting institutional design, and it's interesting to be recalled today. Of course, the challenge that we have is a challenge now of implementation. So the focus will be of our panelists from where we are coming, what are the motivations, as Antonio mentioned, but also where are we going, and precisely what will be the implementation and enforcement issues. So let's start with Alberto Bacchega, that I thank for being with us, who is Director of Markets and Cases for Information, Communications and Media, DG Comp, and it will precisely introduce us to these issues, also with a focus on the interplay between European and the institutional collaboration precisely at different levels. Alberto, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Antonio, and thank you very much to all for the opportunity to participate in this webinar. So I will, I think, concentrate my intervention mostly on the Digital Markets Act, which is the instrument that here in DG Competition we know best. But of course, the Digital Market Acts and the Digital Service Acts are complementary and indeed complement each other, and also the timing of their approval in political approval in March and April of this year respectively is very significant. Perhaps a very quick consideration on the question whether this has been timely or it should have been or if we are late with legislation. It's always difficult to say, of course. The need arises over time, and at some point there is a certain maturity that allows not only to have sufficient knowledge to bring regulation to the market, but sufficient political consensus. I think certainly Europe has showed in this situation that it is in the lead, and it is in the lead globally, because DMA and DSA have no comparable acts in other major economy. Of course, there is a lot of discussion, there is a lot of proposals, a lot of legislation, but I think we are, if not ahead of the curve, we are ahead of our partners in this respect. The other element is that the agreements has been reached in record time for both these instruments. The proposal of the Commission for the DMA is of November 2020, political agreement in March 2022. And this certainly speaks to the wide consensus and political consensus that there was, both at the level of member states and at the European Parliament, of the need of such an instrument. And also, if I may, on the fact that the proposal of the Commission, which has been retained in large part, was robust enough to allow achieving this consensus. So I think we are entering new territory, obviously. We are going further than what competition law has been doing, but we are also building to a large extent of what we have learned through competition law. And there again, what I would like to say that the European Commission has been enforcing competition law in digital markets, perhaps to an extent that also doesn't have a comparison with our major partners. Actually, in the past few years, we sometimes felt a bit lonely in bringing forward cases against big digital platform. Certainly, there is also at the level of competition enforcement a much wider consensus today than there was, for example, 10 years ago, and that's certainly something we do welcome. So going forward, we will have competition enforcement, we will have the Digital Markets Act, and so the question we receive a lot is that okay, is the Digital Market Act superseding competition enforcement? And the clear answer from our point of view is no. Of course, the very reason of the Digital Market Act to exist is not to have to do individual competition cases in a wide range of situations where experience tells us that there are systemic issues, that they are not pointed issues for a specific company with a specific conduct, but they are systemic issues that derive from the specific conditions of digital markets that Antonio was reminding us just before. So what will be the role, or what will be the coordinated role for between competition and ex-ante regulation? But clearly, ex-ante regulation should spare us a lot of repeat work. We have identified systemic issues. We want to address them through regulation. The idea is certainly that we will not have to do competition enforcement in these areas. But let's keep in mind, I think, at least three aspects. One, by design, the DMA will apply to a finite and rather small number of companies. So there will be many other companies also in digital markets that will not be subject to the DMA. Two, markets change, situations evolve. It's difficult to think of a more dynamic sector than the digital sector. So there will be new situations that the DMA cannot foresee. And third, regulations will adapt their behavior, will try to do what is their very legitimate goal, which is to maximize value for their shareholders. So if they find ways to circumvent, in a way, the regulatory provisions to achieve that goal, it's absolutely legitimate until the point when it becomes anti-competitive, and then competition enforcement will clearly retain its role. In a way, there is nothing new here. What is new is that it's the first time we regulate digital markets. But in financial markets, this is a bread and butter of regulation. In payments, it's a very similar story where antitrust enforcement actually has been the inspiration for regulation that has led to the Payment Services Directives and to open banking, for example. So, and telecommunication was already recalled. Energy regulation is another area where the same dynamic took place. So there is something that is very novel and something that is very custom in what is happening now in the digital sector, in my view. The last point, perhaps another point on the construction of the DMA is probably well known, but perhaps just to remind that it's based on three successive checkpoints, all three very important. The first is to identify the companies. That is based on quantitative thresholds, not only, but largely on quantitative thresholds. So it should be a rather quick exercise. The second very important step is to identify the core platform services. This is a closed list contained in the DMA. The Commission proposed 8 in its proposal. These were all retained and 2 were added. So that now we have a closed list of 10 core platform services on which we work. And on each core platform service, there is a list of prohibitions and obligations that apply. So this is the third level of the regulation. So that conditions and obligations have been designed in a way to be directly applicable and self-executing, which of course doesn't mean that everything is clear from day one, but it means first of all that the regulation is meant to be the guide for the gatekeepers, the core platform services, for design the way they will comply with the regulation. And so the dialogue we are having and we want to have with as of now, prospective gatekeepers is on how exactly they will comply with the regulation. But that is changing for us radically the point of view from a competition enforcement standpoint, in which actually we need to prove what the conduct is, and we need to be very prescriptive on what the changes need to be in order to eliminate the anti-competitive effect, to a system where actually we will have a dialogue with the gatekeepers, but where we expect the gatekeepers to tell us how they will comply, and we will do a check on whether this compliance is in line with the provisions of the DMA. We touch upon the collaboration with member states. I think I don't need today to say much that. Of course, it's been Roberto Viola reminded us that the competition will be the sole enforcer of the Digital Market Acts. That doesn't mean the only enforcer. It means that the division of responsibility is very clear, but within the DMA there are a number of provisions to leverage on the collaboration and the excellent collaboration that we have with the National Competition Authority through the European Competition Network in particular. We will we are working actually as we speak on the way we will interact on the DMA. And here there are two dimensions. Of course, there is we need to have the DMA that is enforced alongside competition enforcement at European level, competition enforcement as national level, and also alongside national legislation that is not strictly speaking about competition enforcement, that regulates the digital markets. So this is all an area where it's again new and not so new, because we already coordinate extensively on the application of competition enforcement, but we need to step this effort up. But there is also another element of collaborating in the investigations themselves, that whereby we can collaborate with competition authorities, and we would very, very much welcome that on specific inquiries, also for competition authorities to be our ears and eyes on the ground in the specific national situation, and also allow us both to detect and to check whether the implementation has been done correctly. Finally, there is also a possibility for member states, for 3 member states actually, to initiate investigations on the application of the DMA. So these are certainly elements that show that the will of the Commission is certainly to work very, very closely with the national authorities, be it competition or regulatory, also for the implementation of the DMA. And I think I will stop here for the moment. I'm very happy to take up any questions.
Thank you, Alberto. Meanwhile, there was some questions coming. For instance, one was also related to Roberto, but you can think about for the next round, which is what would be the organizational implications in terms of staff, in terms of organizations, in terms of, I mean, how concretely, if you have already some design, it will evolve. One point that is related to that, and probably Marisa will also tackle from the theoretical point of view, is how this new design will work together with the same antitrust, I mean the standard antitrust action on similar topic, maybe not precisely on the same, but on similar topic, on markets that somehow are affected. I think that we will have the answer to that simply by the experience, by the practice. You know? This is what we will learn over time. But if some ideas there, it would be interesting to understand. So while I will read some other questions, I'll give the floor to Marisa Tierno Centella. I thank you very much, Marisa, for being with us, Director for Competition of the CNMC, that is the National Authority for Competition and markets in Spain. And what is important here is that you have also not only an experience of vertical cooperation with the European Commission, but also horizontal cooperation with the regulator, which is a specific case, very interesting for Spain. Please, Marisa.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to speak in this panel, and also to the two Antonios for the book. I think now you can see it clear, which is a quite multidisciplinary approach to the matter. So
thank you.
There are different backgrounds here. I want to entertain expectations, because I do work in the CNMC, which has indeed the two sets, the regulatory set and the competition set, but I am Director General for Competition. And my previous experience is in the European Commission in DG Comp, so enforcing competition. So what you really can expect from me is more the competition side of matters and the DMA, including the experience of having been in both situations as European Commission and National Competition Authority. I wanted to make first a general approximation, to what the DMA is, without trying not to repeat what has already been said. But as we have seen, the DMA applies to core platform services, not to anything that the gatekeepers do, to core platform services provided and offered by gatekeepers, both to businesses and to end users established in the European Union. In the case of end users, they can also be located in the European Union. And then such gatekeepers that are designated by the European Commission, as Alberto has been mentioned, we can see them a bit as incumbents in two-sided markets. So they control access both to the demand by business users and to supply by end users. And as a consequence, the DMA places on them asymmetrical obligations and prohibitions. So they don't have the same duties, let's say, as everybody else. In that sense, it is a bit similar to a company that is in the dominant position in competition law. But of course, the process to get in there is quite different. So it is fair to say that most of these prohibitions and obligations derive from the experience that has been gathered in former competition cases, not only by the European Commission, although mainly by the European Commission. And this includes the learning that it is worth introducing ex ante and per se rules prescribing or prohibiting some behaviors for those companies, because the traditional antitrust system requires that you establish what is the market power exactly in each case, that you go through all the elements, possible efficiencies, and that you do an extensive fact-finding. So it is unlikely to be timely. I mean, it's very good when you have very big cases and you can do that, and then you set a precedent, as has been done up to now. But of course, platforms tackle a lot of services so wide and so quickly that a single case can make an example, but cannot tackle all the practices that are going to come forward. Therefore, the DMA says it has complementary objectives to competition objectives. This is something that can be, discussed because of this origin. But what is true is that when these objectives are contestability and fairness, the part on fairness is something that is only, let's say, collateral in competition enforcement. And the part that is contestability is tackled very much by merger regime, which is also an ex ante regime. And then in antitrust cases, what you have is a different situation in which, for markets that evolve so quickly, for markets where you have these scales and economies, then you would just be too late. You wouldn't be able to remedy in time, so that some of the opportunities have disappeared. And then there is the question of the administrability of remedies. So sometimes it's not that you don't have the remedies, it's that you don't arrive in time to reestablish the contestability. So that's a bit the thing. And when we were speaking about consensus, indeed, there is an increasing consensus that has only be built after cases have come forward, that under enforcement in this area not in general, but in this area, is more costly than over-enforcement. These questions about the type A, type 1, type 2 errors. So then I would say that when you look into the current text as it is foreseen, you will see that there is this article 1.5 and this article 1.6 when we are looking into the question of what can go in parallel with the DMA now that the DMA will be in place. And then what it says is that the member states cannot impose further obligations on gatekeepers by way of legislation. And then it says also up to administrative measures. For me, that is, but under the control of those who have written it, more thinking about other ex-ante measures. So I'm not very sure that there is scope for matters that are within the DMA for any small DMA on gatekeepers by national authorities. I think that this is over after when the DMA will be adopted and in place. And then we have our 1.6, which is the one that is speaking about the application of Articles 101 and 102, and also of the equivalent national competition rules to, I mean, in general, to anybody. So the DMA applies irrespective of this. But as Alberto has said, there is no point to tackle the same practice both under the DMA and Article 101 and 102 at the same time on the same company. I mean, what would be the purpose of that? The timing, the efficiencies. So the issue is that we would be applying competition rules normally to in other situations, no? So those who are not gatekeepers or those situations that have not been tackled. Still, there is the possibility of, you know, having this defense of the ne bis in idem. There is this debate about the ne bis in idem. However, we have had a couple of rulings, one of which relates to the situation of regulatory enforcement and competition enforcement, because the other one is about competition authorities acting at the same time from different member states. And that is the post ruling, which is C-117/20, which is really very timely because it's very recent and that we have read all with a lot of attention. And there are some precisions about what is bis in idem and what is not. I can come back on that later, but I don't want to dwell on each of the topics. So then the issue, yes, the European Commission is the final sole enforcer of the DMA. I have to say that the national competition authorities managed, I think, to be heard by the European Council because there was a joint paper of the national competition authorities asking to introduce another role for us different from the original proposal of the Commission. Now it is a bit in the middle. One would wonder whether we couldn't have imported really the system of Regulation 1/2003 because the rules would have been the same, but we have understood the reasons also that have been maintained by the Commission and by the co-legislators. So the point is that we can investigate the practices that was extremely necessary because, of course, as one of the areas of the regulation says, you don't know from the outset sometimes which type of regulation, I mean, of law is going to be applied, whether it will be the DMA or it is going to be competition or it is going to be the two of them. So what cannot be done is that the effort of investigation of the competition authority is lost, because also that would incentivize that the national competition authorities would ever get close to the gatekeepers if you are going to investigate for nothing. So I think that that is a very important issue. And then there are other roles in between that I will intend to explain later on when I go more in detail on the mechanics of the cooperation, so that I don't take all the time for myself. Just to say at the end that for us it is business as usual. We cannot wait until the DMA is in force, because we are saying that these markets go very quickly. So to the extent that we have the possibility, we would continue to enforce competition rules also on gatekeepers as long as the DMA is not yet there. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisa. Very clear, and also we will give you the floor to go in details, as you mentioned, on some mechanics. I think what is really important is precisely this that goes also, even if it's not properly legally correct, this nebis in idem issue, because it's not precisely a nebis in idem, is something a little bit more on overlap. You know that we have, of course, this fundamental distinction between the European approach and the US approach, as in the famous Trinco case has been shown on ex ante and ex post, because we believe that even in a context of regulation, of clear regulation, if there is still a pace for special responsibility, which means discretion by a dominant firm, then in that case, even if we are in a regulated issues, but if there are some freedom of economic activity by a dominant firm, in this case by a gatekeeper, this may in any case raise issue for antitrust intervention. So I think that, of course, the issue is very complex here, and maybe we can say something later on by you and by Alberto, because Alberto mentioned also national legislations, not only national decisions. And we know that in Germany is already there. In Italy, there is a proposal of having new legislation on antitrust that may interfere to some extent to what we are discussing now on the DMA. So it's interesting also to have a look at that. But we will come back, Marisa, to that. And right now, have you seen that we have some questions on precisely on the topic raised by Marisa on how complementarity between DMA and antitrust, classical antitrust will be there. Some other on interoperability and IP interconnection, etc. And maybe Chiara could say something also to that topic, because it's covered by BEREC. Some other issues just going on the relationship between DMA enforcement and politics, etc. But I mean, you see these questions, and it's up to the panelists to take something from there and to reply. Now, Chiara, thank you for being with us. Is here because we want to see also the interconnection with the telecommunications on the BEREC side, I mean, on the side of the regulators. Here, what is interesting is that we can see on the one side some overlap. Think, for instance, to the issues that also Roberto mentions of regulating, instant messaging and the interoperability there, which has been an important issue between DMA and DSA, both the cases. Because there are, of course, competition reasons there, but also technical constraints that need to be solved. But generally speaking, we had in the past something very interesting overlapping in the BEREC side. I think, for instance, to the all issues that at a certain point was the most important one on net neutrality, no? And the net neutrality was the opposite case, in which the gatekeeper was the telecommunication operator, trying to influence, the freedom of the users in favor of some content. While I have to say that now the shift is on the other side of the problem. So how things do evolve over time, depending also on the market structure, because the issue of net neutrality actually born in the USA, where the market structure for telecommunications quite different than the one that we have in Europe. So, Chiara, the floor is yours. There are many issues on which you can touch upon on the relationship between the world of regulation telecommunications and DMA DSA. Please, Chiara.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to both Antonios and for the invitation and for this exciting discussion. I think that now that the DMA is almost final, and it was said before by Roberto Viola that it will be adopted, published in the official journal by the end of the year. I think that the title of the conference is very key. So it's about the concrete challenges about the enforcement, because this is, of course, what will be more what will be crucial actually in the next months and next years. And I think that the panel today also gives a pretty good overview of the different points of view and types of challenging seen from the point of view of the Commission, competition authorities, and us as ex-ante regulators in electronic communications. I think that for the topic, yes, I can intervene on many different things, but I think I will build on the keynote speech by Roberto Viola so that I will develop a bit more some of his points. First of all, he mentioned that at the beginning of the conference, he mentioned that the DMA will be enforced by a joint team at the DigiComp and DigiConnect. And in the press some days ago, the European Commission also said that there are some obligations which will more naturally, let's say, fall in the realm of DigiConnect or DigiCompetition. So as an ex-ante regulator, what I will do is that I will take a concrete example that was also mentioned by Roberto before, which is interoperability for number-independent interpersonal communication services. And it sounds very weird when we say it like this, but then I will explain a bit what it means. These concrete examples to see what are the challenges, at least some of the challenges that I see like concretely for the enforcement. And then I would also like to say something about the governance, which was mentioned also by the other speakers, but I will probably leave it for the Q&A afterwards. So on the first point about interoperability, so the final version of the DMA includes interoperability measures for gatekeepers providing NICs. And I guess that most of the participants know what interoperability is and what NICs are. But for those who don't know, so NICs are those services which are for communication, and they are number independent. So it means that they do not connect with publicly assigned numbering resources. And when they use numbers, it is for as a mere identifier. So it can be instant messaging services. So we all think of WhatsApp, for instance. It can be video conference services. So for example, Microsoft Teams or email services. And interoperability between these NICs means that someone on WhatsApp would be able to communicate with someone else who's using Signal or Telegram, for instance. If Signal and Telegram wish to interconnect with WhatsApp, which is, of course, not necessarily the case, but to be seen. And or it also means that someone on Microsoft Teams would be able to speak with someone on Zoom and so on. For the email services, I think it gives a very concrete examples because it's a technical interoperability is also in place, so it works. Someone who's using Gmail, for instance, can write to someone else who's using a different and competing provider. So this is what interoperability would look like. And according to the new article of the DMA, so it was added later on, because at the beginning it was not in the proposal of the European Commission, but it was something which was very much supported and proposed by the European Parliament. And in the new article of the DMA, they say that the gatekeepers will have to provide basic functionalities, and they also explain what is the timing. So they will start with the end-to-end text messages between two users, then after some years within groups, then after some more years, video calls and voice calls and so on. So it is defined in the DMA, so we'll not focus on this. But so the main challenging I see are three. So the first one is the identification of the scope of the measures which have to be applied, because of course, we present them as, so the European Commission, they present them as obligations which will be applied very easily. And for some of them, this is the case. And I think it's a good framework to start with clear rules and so on, especially because it's the first regulation in the digital sector. But of course, there are some other measures like interoperability where it will not be applied overnight in an easy way. So it has to be defined. So the first one is the identification of the scope of the measure. The second one is the correct identification of the obligation. And the third challenge is the impact of the measure. So how to take this into account. So in ex-ante regulation, the identification of the scope of the measure to be applied is of course the primary thing is crucial. It's one of the very first thing to be done. And the DMA is peculiar because it's an ex-ante regulation, but all the obligations are clearly defined in the text, which is not the case in the telecom sector, for instance. We have much more flexibility in the definition of the remedies. So, so for instance, interoperability for NICs can be applied either to the services. So we say, okay, it will be applied, for instance, messaging services, or it can be applied to the functionalities, for instance. So we say we make interoperable end-to-end text messages, and this can be either it is on a service like WhatsApp or it is on a service like Teams. It is just the functionality which is made interoperable. So this kind of definition of the scope is something that needs to be done. So my understanding in the DMA is that they are focusing rather on the functionalities, so that WhatsApp, for instance, should be made interoperable with other messaging services, and also Microsoft Teams with other video conferencing services. For their messaging functionalities. But then it may also mean that WhatsApp and Teams should be interoperable if we just look at the functionality of messaging. So it is, you see that it seems clear when we read the text, but actually when we want to apply it, there are challenges to be taken into account. And the second challenge is so the correct definition of the obligation. And for interoperability measures in the text, it is said that it is the gatekeepers who will publish a reference offer. A reference offer is something that we already know in telecom. It details all the technical details and the general terms and conditions of this interconnection. And the DMA also mentioned the potential involvement of BEREC. So for those who don't know, BEREC is the European network of electronic communication regulators. And so there is the involvement of BEREC to assess this reference offer, which is proposed by the gatekeepers. And this is something that we, of course, very much welcome, because we think that we can assist the Commission in this part, because it's something that we have already done in our sector. But what we also think is that on top of involving electronic communication regulators, would be important also to include in this regulatory dialogue, which was mentioned before by the Commission, also other third parties beyond only the gatekeepers. And because we know that it was mentioned before also by Antonio, there are very strong information asymmetries in this sector, and it is key for the Commission. It will enable them to gather really very important information and data from the field if they let stakeholders react on these proposals by the gatekeepers for the implementation of the measure. So we really think it's something that we have proposed from the very beginning, and so I really think that it's one of the key points to reduce information asymmetry, to let also beyond regulators, to let also third parties who will ask for this interoperability measure to react on the proposal by the gatekeeper and say, for instance, okay, this technical detail is not enough, we need further details to interconnect. So this regulatory dialogue for me is beyond just Commission and gatekeepers, but involves also other stakeholders. And finally, the last challenge I see is about the impact of the measure, of course. When we define the specifications of the measure, of course, you also take into account, I mean, you do it in a way that minimizes the potentially negative effects. So for interoperability, the negative effect can be in terms of a higher level of collection of data by the actor, or lower security of the communication. And the European Commission has it in mind, is aware of this. Of course, it is also mentioned in the DMA, but it's of course one of the challenges. And I only mentioned it from the point of view of end users, like on these two concrete points, data and security of communication. But of course, there is also in terms of innovation and so on. But I will not go into this. So this, just briefly on the challenges that I see, and as a BEREC, what we are doing, we are currently working on a report for the implementation of interoperability measures for NICs. And we work closely also with the services of the European Commission at DG Connect. And the idea is indeed to tackle all these challenges that I mentioned, and to provide some proposals, concrete proposals to the European Commission, and to assist them and support them with the enforcement of the DMA. So that's all on my side. And I have a question, I mean, can detail a bit more on the governance and how this can interact and interplay with other similar obligations that we have in the telco sector, but maybe I will leave it afterwards, since other speakers will also intervene on the governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chiara. That of course is here I mentioned as co-chair of the BEREC working group on market economic analysis, but she's deputy head of Economic Analysis and Digital Affairs Unit at ARCEP, France. I mean, you raised just two examples, but very, very important in this respect, precisely to recall the collaboration needed also on what we could think as more core telecommunication sides, but it is very, very, very important and fundamental in some of the features that you're mentioning. Now, interoperability is certainly one of that. Data, certainly. And let me just recall, I was thinking when you mentioned that we had two recitals, if I remember well, should be like 16 or 18, I don't remember, two recitals of the new telecommunications code for electronic communications in Europe that is precisely mentioning that data is the value now of the telecommunications, so that even thinking to the traditional service in terms of the stream of profits coming precisely on old services is something that can change if the value is on data. Then this means also that the BEREC's approach to those services may change as long as data become central. So I think this is very important in what you said. Now let me switch to Elisa Giomi, Commissioner of the Italian Authority for Telecommunications and Media, Communications and Media. AGCOM is one of the few convergent independent authorities in Europe. So it's particularly important the role of this convergent. The other convergent one was actually Ofcom, that is not anymore, unfortunately, from my point of view, in Europe.
Also TMC, also the Spanish one. Yeah. The
Spanish, yes. But we had a typical convergence from the very beginning. And Elisa Giomi, who is a professor, but she's now commissioner, and she's actually also a member of the Italian chapter of the IIC. And I want to ask to Elisa to start something a little bit that is in the DSA, DMA, but has to do much more on the pluralism side of the story, since we have already talking about other issue. And so what do you think that this evolution could help in this discussion in terms of pluralism? How things are changing and all the stuff that we have analyzed from data to pluralism online, to pluralism offline. I mean, what could be the reflection, a broad analysis on the steps we are doing with this initiative at the European level and in the collaboration with the national authorities? Elisa.
Sure. Thank you, Antonio, for this very interesting occasion. And I had guessed that at this point of the discussion, much would have been said, and it is just so. Therefore, I thought that I could focus on this specific digital market among the main digital markets you explore, which is the digital market of information. You touch upon, you and Antonio, the other Antonio, touch upon this market.
The Antonios.
All the heroes, as Augusto defined you. Okay, so you touch upon this market in several chapters. But there is one chapter where a very well-structured research question is made, which is the last chapter. You ask yourselves how algorithmic efficiency can impact pluralism. And if I get it correctly, your line of reasoning is that the rise of platforms lead to a profound change of the information dynamics, allowing users to participate in the production of content, but at the same time, clearly it also leads to the spread of illegal content and to the rise of many problems affecting the linearity of information process, to summarize. So you ask yourself, this is a sort of pluralism dilemma, and it calls for regulatory intervention. But how? And then you go on analyzing the DMA provisions in this slide. Now, what I'd like to do is precisely to give a closer look to pluralism and to this suggested dilemma, also with the aim to verify if the terms of this dilemma remain the same you so clearly describes. Secondly, I'd like to explore, to shed on a little light onto the twofold role played by platforms. And in so doing, I would like to go on and follow in the line that we started with the December conference organized by the Italian chapter, which was dedicated to platform benefits. And finally, I'd like to reflect on the DSA and also on the Code of Practice on Disinformation, which, as you of course know, is strictly linked to the DSA itself. It was recently released last week, I believe. Now, I will go on very quick on the first part. When talking about the impact of algorithms on the information ecosystem, you refer to two main problems, which is all the phenomena that go under the label of information disorder and the issue of personalized information. And your concern is that all of this is likely to affect pluralism. There is specifically paid here you state it very clearly. Your concern, your feeling is that disinformation strategies may succeed as the online public debate turned to be highly fragmented, unverified, chaotic, self-selected, and polarized. You fear that phenomena such as polarized falsehoods, I really like this definition, or echo chambers or filter bubbles, and the algorithmic profiling itself is likely to harm pluralism. Let me go on by saying that the notion, the definition of pluralism you are elaborating on is pluralism as the variety of expressed opinions and available information sources, something which is translated as internal pluralism in the Italian law, but okay, we do not need to go in detail here. Okay, pluralism as the diversification and variety of point of views, which are the preliminary condition for public opinion to develop and grow and be as much informed and aware as possible. Okay, this said, everything is true. Clearly, the concern you express should not be overlooked. At the same time, I think it could be useful also in order to evaluate the impact of regulation, to consider, so to speak, the other side of the coin, highlighting some possible ways in which platforms are likely to benefit rather than harming pluralism. A first preliminary move, a theoretical and also empirical one from my point of view, here is to highlight the ambivalent relation between traditional media and platforms. And to put it very, very sharply, blatantly, I mean, we should stop idealizing mainstream media and traditional news outlets as opposed to evil platforms. It is something which I really find irritating somehow, if I may say. This is not something you do. None of the Antonios, I swear, does this in their book, but this is, you know, a widespread rhetoric, because we tend to idealize what is old as opposed to what is new and frightening somehow. But of course, this opposition and idealization is absolutely fake. First of all, because in the digital information ecosystem, everyone competes in the information and attention markets. And traditional media have also adopted opportunistic behavior, so to speak, emulating the operational mechanism and attention-catching strategies typical of platforms. And they did well. I mean, they have to survive in that very challenging and fierce environment. So the result is that, just to quote the most simple examples, that news outlets' websites are full of clickbait lists and catchy headlines and so forth. There is this very interesting book by Abramson, 2021, titled Merchants of Truth, which probably copied the title of Antonio Nicita's latest book, very similar. It is very interesting because it kind of analyzes all the ways in which traditional news outlet emulate the functioning of online services offered by platforms. Second, it is very important, in my view, to bear in mind that far from being only exploited, the content and the product of traditional media also gain from their presence on platforms. Here, I believe that the distribution, the internal distribution, the shares of the digital online advertising market is very telling. This market, it is worth 3 billion euros, and it is split 2/3 between the major big techs, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and only 1/3 between publishers, traditional publishers. These data come from the Media Pluralism Monitor, which is, as you know, a very well informed report, and it is it dates to 2020. Okay, now, clearly, this balance is tilted in favor of platforms, and especially in favor of three big players. So, of course, there is an issue here. But it is also true that the death of newspapers was already announced when I enrolled in communication studies as a student in mid-90s. Everyone started saying newspapers are dying. Now, just to be a little bit thought-provoking, platforms contribute a lot to the third of the online advertising market shared between publishers. And they do so through intermediation services, positioning services, news aggregators tool, and so forth. Me, for example, I found out about the existence of newspapers that I had never heard before, thanks to news aggregator tool offered by the most popular platform. And it is something which benefits pluralism if we define it in terms of diversification and variety of news and information sources. Clearly, nothing is black or white. So at the same time, we cannot ignore that some platforms use walled gardens that lock users within the app in order to keep collecting data from readers and without sharing much about it. So yes, I'm not saying that platforms are just Samaritans towards traditional news outlets and publishers. A number of conclusions here. From the point of view of regulators, I would say that it is unfair to hold only one actor in the information supply chain, namely platforms, responsible for all this information pollution and burden only them with regulation. Rather, each actor should be given its own role and responsibility. A strengthened accountability of media outlets could be auspicable at this regard, of course, preserving proportionality and taking into account their key role for democratic society. Second, on the side of platforms, and I am almost done, the adoption of the DSA, which is at its last stage, I guess provides very important and suitable tools, not so much to counter the dynamics we mentioned above, personalized information, echo chambers, polarized falsehood, and so forth, but in order to empower users. DSA provide them with a chance, with the ability to break out of information echo chambers, which is very important because echo chambers as well as filter bubbles actually are not a problem per se. As you know, at least in the field of media studies, many scholars nowadays questions that there is a difference between online and offline social interactions, homophilia being a main criterion driving all of our choices and exposition and content selection. But at the same time, it is clearly homophilia amplified by algorithmic profiling. So yes, these problems become very relevant when talking about the recipient side, the audience side. Yeah. Okay, there are some particular provision in DSA that I find very relevant in order to empower users and to enable them to escape from dark patterns and other tricky stuff they find in platforms. Article 26 about the risk assessment, Article 29 about the recommender systems, and then the article about advertising registry. Now I'm not going into detail what this provision, we can talk about it later eventually. Very last, the European Commission and the Code of Practice on Disinformation, which is a very interesting novelty. As you know, it dates back to 2018, and now finally it was signed by 34 signatories who have joined the revision process started in 2018. And even though DSA has not come into force, do you say come into force? Yes, not come into force yet. The European Commission stated that the Code of Practice on Disinformation will be effective within the framework of the DSA. So there is a strong interaction between the two, and it is very important that relevant players in the industry agreed for the first time on self-regulatory standards, and that this code will find its enforcement within the framework of the DSA. Agicom, just a bit on AGCOM. Yes, it is a holistic, so to speak, regulatory body. And I believe that considering the features of nowadays digital ecosystem, it is very important to be able to rely on a convergent authority, which is able to take care of media user empowerment along with all the other markets and markets regulation. What I see as a very important goal, I think, is to try to move away from the legislative paternalism that has characterized the intervention of recent years. And talking about consumer empowerment, the user empowerment, I do believe that this is one of the most interesting challenges that awaits for us. AGCOM is in charge of media and digital literacy as well. Okay, sorry for being a little bit clumsy.
Thank you, Elisa. Thank you, Elisa. We will rebalance with the other the timing between this and the late. But one point that before going to Alexandra, one point is very important that you mentioned is precisely among all the others is precisely this idea to tackle the issues of disinformations and generally the protection of users, and not only focusing on the web side of the story, because things are complex, and sometimes what we see is that we use actually the information on the web precisely to counter disinformation on mainstream media. So this is important. It's important the fact that you mentioned the holistic approach of an authority like AGCOM and like others, precisely because the issue of disinformation should be something sort of regarding the ecosystem and not just one source or the other, because we have right now some paradoxes for which that, for instance, looking at the COVID issues, COVID-19, we had that in sometimes platforms labeled as disinformation some sources that, notwithstanding, found some space in mainstream media, and this is a paradox, you know. So talking about code of disinformation, now probably the next step should be to have a systemic approach towards disinformation regarding all the medias, because we have the paradox that sometimes regulated media have less attitude to counter, not all, but some, it could happen, lower attitude to counter disinformation than what we observe at the web. But we can talk later on that. Alexander, now Professor Destrel is really one of the major experts we have at the European level. Is professor at the University of Namur and also is in CER, but also in many other institutions like the European University Institute, where we met years ago. Don't say how many years ago. And you know his works, and is really is an expert on the different initiatives on digital markets. So I just give the floor to Alex on what he heard, what would like to focus on, and then he could come back. And later on, Antonio will give the floor to you for the next round, okay? Alex.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So first, I would like to congratulate you for the book. I mean, as the previous one is very good, you are probably as productive as the EU lawmaker in the digital space, but you are much clearer. And I prefer to read your book than the DMA or the DSA. Because you, and I think Roberto mentioned that at the beginning, you not only give a very comprehensive view of the different regulation, and we mentioned here the DMA, and Elisa has just mentioned the DSA, but also you do it in a very succinct and clear manner, and with the rationale behind. And I think that's really your, I mean, your originality, and which I really like a lot. So thanks for the effort you put in that, and for the academic community and policy community, the service the positive externality you create to us. Now, I want to focus my remark on what I have been heard, and that was mostly on the DMA and maybe one point on the DSA. And on the DMA, I want to make 2 points. One is regarding objective, which didn't discuss that a lot, and then the one is on governance. Because, you know, I am now in the US, and some people read the DMA as a public utility regulation. And I think it's not a public utility regulation. And I think we should be very clear on that, because there is a kind of, you know, sometimes misunderstanding of what the DMA is. I think it is, and Alberto recalled that at the beginning, a kind of pro-competitive regulation. I think the contestability objective is probably the most important of the two. I mean, I don't mean that fairness is not that important, but the contestability in the sense of lowering the entry barriers is really what the DMA is about. And it's not a thing, but we can discuss it. I don't think it is a public utility regulation. That means that the KPI or the indicator of success will be, because that's also a question which is often raised, you know, how in 5 years or in 10 years we will see the indicator of success. It will not be the number of the decision of the commission or but it will be how the market has changed. And I think the indicator of success could be to which extent the barrier have indeed been lowered, the entry barriers have indeed been lowered, and to which extent we end up to a kind of more decentralized internet. You know, Antonio number one referred to a romantic view of the internet at the beginning, which did not happen. And the question is how far the DMA will contribute to come back in a way to this kind of romantic view of the internet. So that's for the objective, but I think we need to be very clear on what we try to achieve here. In terms of governance, I think centralization was clearly a good choice. I think Roberto has explained why, and it's clear to me that, and it's also, as Roberto recalled, a big step in the European integration. So paradoxically or ironically, in a way, the big tech are with Ukraine one of the big push and COVID, one of the big push of the European integration. Now, that says, I think it is clear that a national authority have probably not the ability nor the incentive to alone regulate global platform, you know. So that's why I think centralization is a good thing. It put a huge responsibility and a new responsibility on the European Commission, as both Roberto and Alberto have recalled. That means, and especially so, that the Commission enjoys a relatively high margin of discretion in enforcing the DMA, in the sense that, for instance, how much they want to have participatory regulation. You know, Chiara was mentioning the importance of discussing not only with gatekeeper, but also with other players. I mean, there is a lot of discretion in the law for the Commission on that. So, you know, the question is whether the Commission is ready and is a good institution to do that. I think it could, obviously, and it should, but it will need to change. And there is two important points that you always find in EU law when you talk about national regulatory authority, that is independence and expertise. You know, now on independence, I think that at some point we will have more and more tension between the need or the willingness of the Commission to become more and more geopolitical on the one hand, and the additional regulatory power that the Commission has. I think at some point we will have a clash. And I was, I mean, some of you may have attended the conference of the EDPS, the European Data Protection Supervisor, organized last week about the enforcement of the GDPR, and clearly the EDPS wants to have a more centralized enforcement of the GDPR, like we have in the DMA and the DSA. And Commissioner Renders was there, and he said, I mean, it could not be the Commission if we want to go to a centralized enforcement. And he said, I don't want, but if we want, it could not be the Commission, because the Commission is not independent. And there is, in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, a requirement of the privacy enforcer to be independent. Now, there is no constitutional requirement of independence for antitrust or in the Treaty for Antitrust or for regulation, but you see, it is in a way expected. And so I think there is a kind of a tension there. And so how it can be solved, I think it's very important that the due process is respected. And I mean, the Qualcomm case of 2 days ago recalled the importance of due process. I don't I mean, I think the court, I don't fully agree with the court, but I think on the due process point, I think it was an important point to make. Transparency is also very important, and participation. You know, the way to get, you know, given the fact that the Commission is a geopolitical body, it's even more important that for national regulatory authority, due process, transparency, and participation. And then we have the other point, which is about expertise. I mean, we have discussed that a lot, the question of hiring technologists within the Commission. It will be extremely key. And so all the kind of transformation that Mario Monti initiated 20 years ago with the chief economist team and all of that. I mean, it's probably the same kind of transformation that should be done within the Commission, but I guess this is what they are doing. The last point I want to say about the Commission is the importance of maximizing the synergies between or across the antitrust enforcement, DMA enforcement, and DSA enforcement, because of course the three instruments have not the same objective, but they will target the same firm and the same algorithm. And I'm not sure how far the exchange of confidential information across the teams doing antitrust, DSA, and DMA is possible. So maybe Alberto could come back on that. But I think it's very important that the synergies around the enforcement of the three instruments are maximized. And then the second point is the Commission will not will not able to do it alone. That's clear, and everybody recognized that, and it has also been mentioned by Marisa and Chiara before. So it means what? It means to involve the gatekeeper and their user. There is, of course, a trade-off between speed of decision and participation, you know, and the Commission was very cautious during the negotiation of the DMA to remain the sole decider of that trade-off. You know, and it's clear, and I think it's good that the Commission decide, because the Commission is the best place to decide the trade-off. But we should be mindful of not, you know, trading speed over participation. Okay, so I think that's extremely important. So participation of the gatekeeper, of course, but also their business user, and participation of the national authority, national agency. And there I like a lot what Alberto was mentioning in the sense of the distinction. I understood which was made between the involvement of the national authority within the DMA and next to the DMA. Okay, within the DMA, clearly the national authority have an important role to play, and the question is how this coordination will be organized. One model I like a lot is financial regulation, where for the biggest bank of Europe, for the significant bank, the ECB, which is the enforcer of this financial supervision in the EMU, team up with the national supervisor, and they set up joint investigation team. You know, so really they team up quite closely together. That may be a model to be explored. It seems to work in banking supervision. Of course, the situations are not exactly the same, but are similar. But the question is what happened of the role of the national authority next to the DMA, or I would say even over the top the DMA. Because clearly, I mean, the national competition, well, for instance, this section 19A in Germany, could be used against the same player, but to add additional obligation under a competition law. So in a way, you know, I think we should read the DMA as a kind of minimum harmonization for the whole Europe, but that can be topped up by national intervention on the basis of national competition law. And so the question is, first, what does it mean for the internal market? And second, what can we learn from those national experiences? Because it's you know, if Germany wants to go further and regulate further than the DMA, Apple or Google or Facebook or whatever, it will be interesting to learn from that experience and how that feedback will feed into the next revision of the DMA. I think it's very important. Roberto was mentioning that a lot of this law will be learning by regulating, learning on the job, but it's learning by the Commission, but it's also learning by the national authority, and how that learning can feed up at the European level. So you know, to sum up, I think the DMA should be understood as pro-competitive regulation, not so much as a public utility regulation, and its success will be seen as how far the barriers to entries have been decreased, and to some extent how the decentralized enforcement, the decentralized internet, we have a more decentralized internet. And then in terms of governance, I think centralization is a good thing, but the question is how we reconcile this requirement of independence and requirement, at least a good policy requirement, it's not a constitutional requirement, and expertise with the geopolitical role of the Commission, and how the Commission could provide some safeguards for independence, and how the trade-off between speed and participation is organized, and in the specific context of the national authority, how the trade-off between a kind of minimum harmonization of the DMA and the possibility of the company to of the national authority to go further, how that will be organized. Now, a last point on the DSA, because I think it was less mentioned. I mean, Elisa mentioned that a lot, and rightly so. I think, to me, the most interesting but obscure provision of the DSA is the systemic risk assessment that the very large online platform will have to do on their service. I think this is the most possibly transformative provision of the DSA, but we don't really know what it is, you know. And so I think for your next book, Antonio, maybe you could enlighten us with your expertise and pedagogical style. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex, and it was very interesting and comprehensive intervention yours, as usual. And also, I think you put a lot of questions on the table, especially for Alberto. So because a lot of questions were addressed to the Commission side. So I guess it's a good way to start the second round of intervention with Alberto, that maybe can develop some of the arguments he mentioned before, or also answer to some of the questions that Alex, a lot of interesting and very relevant questions that Alex put on the plate. And another thing that I would like to mention, maybe it's not possible to answer, but I think it's an interesting side. Of course, as we mentioned, decentralization could be of the enforcement in the DMA could be a bit not jeopardized, but anyway made a little bit effective on development of national competition law, which are over the top of the DMA, as Alex said, especially in some member states, in Germany, the propose in Italy about abuse of economic dependency. But also I'm curious, and this is quite evident, but I'm curious also if of course the European Commission, of course, being able, DG Comp, or anyway the European Commission more generally speaking, being able to apply both the DMA and the European competition law, of course, there is the decentralization, the modernization of European competition law. My curiosity is whether, I believe there will be no answer to that, but whether there will be a change in the approach of the Commission regarding the relationship between DG Comp and the National Competition Authority in the enforcement of European competition law. In other terms, the functional superiority of the European Commission in enforcing the Article 101 or 102, so namely Article 11, paragraph 6, or 16, paragraph 2 of the Regulation 1/2003. There could be some changes in the approach of the Commission regarding to cases which could be more close to DMA as well. So in a sense,
yes,
sense,
it's clear.
Yeah.
May I add one point? May I add, since we have several questions in the chat that we have read while we were listening to the others, if any of the panelists would like to pick up some of the questions. Some are specific. For instance, one is for Elisa. Other one are general, so everyone would like also to add something there.
Yeah, but I will start with Alberto with answering some of the points that Alex made. Alberto and Marisa, of course, because they are complementary in a way. So that's...
Thank you very much. Indeed, there are many themes. I'm sure I will do a lot of injustice by only picking up a few references. If there are any punctual questions, please let me know, and I will try to be quick on a very few points, starting with points that Alexander made. Independence. Of course, independence of a competition enforcement authority is always a very important and also a very tricky point. I don't see how that would change significantly from the need of independence that we have in enforcing antitrust control or measure control to enforcing the DMA. And if I may add, perhaps enforcing state aid control probably brings even more questions about independence. I can only say that my very personal belief is that the European Commission has demonstrated the capacity of being independent, has demonstrated the capacity of enforcing sometimes against the most immediate wills of perhaps the member states, because what we have is rules that are as clearly as they can be, and that's our mandate. Of course, that's a very easy and institutional answer one can give. I don't want to underplay the challenges we have. I think we share these challenges also with other authorities across the world. Of course, we depend by the College of Commissioners that takes decision, as much as our colleagues in the US depend on the appointed commissioners or on the advocate generals. So I think that question, which is very relevant, I really don't know how to answer it to a better extent. At the point on the national competition law and DMA enforcement, there is clear provision in the DMA to avoid contradictory outcomes between national competition law and DMA. In particular, that national decisions or application could undermine the DMA obligations and provisions. There is no provision in the DMA that prevents national competition authority to go further than what the DMA requires. And I think I agree with Alexander that it will be very interesting to see how this develops, and certainly it will be a learning point for us to understand whether over time we need to refocus or adapt or update also this instrument, as much as it will be to see our close friends of the UK will apply their legislation once it will be in place, and what will happen in the US and in other jurisdictions. On the point of whether the DMA is more to improve contestability in digital markets or to ensure fairness, again, I agree with Alexander. The DMA is a tool that stems from the consciousness that contestability is not there. It has decreased significantly over time, and for all the characteristics of the market we know, the market dynamics don't help contestability in digital markets. I would only add that from our point of view, contestability brings fairness. Actually, is one of the means to achieve fairness for innovators to be able to bring their innovation to the consumer, achieve fairness in the sense that it gives better choice to consumers as well. And I don't know, there was a very initial question I retained, and sorry, I didn't manage to read all of them, regarding the staff that was for the staffing that was for the DSA. So I'm really not well placed to answer that. I know it was directed at Roberto Viola. On the DMA staff, I think everyone knows there was an indication with the DMA in the famous fiche financière of 80 full-time equivalent needed for the implementation of the DMA. That was based on the Commission proposal that now the DMA has been expanded. So I think that's a ballpark figure that maybe should revise upwards. The only thing I would, want to keep in mind there, that is staffing the DMA and working on the DMA doesn't mean, plugging people out from one place and putting them in another place. There is already a lot of people, both in Connect, in the legal service, who are working on the DMA. So when I know there is a lot of curiosity about knowing how many, honestly, it would be difficult for us to do the count, but it's already a big effort in these very early stages of the implementation, also on our side, also because we have to set up the system, and that is a one-off effort. And on this, I'm very happy to answer any other questions if you could remind me of those, but I don't want to take time from the other speakers either.
Thank you very much, Alberto. And yeah, I think you pretty much answered to all the questions. The other one is about the enforcement on the different approach that could be on the Regulation 1/2003. So the functional superiority of the DG Comp towards vis-a-vis national competition authority, whether the centralization could also be accompanied with a different approach, more centralized approach of the European Commission, especially
very telegraphically, very good food for thought, but I think it's way too early to give an indication there. We just announced the evaluation of Reg 1. That is not going to be something. This would be, I think, far too early to think of that. I think that the relationship with the national competition authorities has worked well under Reg 1. Everything can be improved, but we would want to keep the same balance and the same spirit of collaboration that we've had so far.
Okay, thank you very much. And at this point, I will give the floor to Marisa to listen to her position on those issues, on the other topics that she wants to deepen and elaborate a bit more.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to be concise on each point, but I wanted to tackle a few things that have come up. Yeah. So one of the things that I wanted to say, to start with the issue of the relationship between the competition network, let's say, and this DMA, is that you see the inspiration in the mechanisms that you find in the DMA, the clear inspiration in what we have learned from the application of Regulation 1/2003. And some of these things have been included expressly, and the ones that have not been included, I think it was for a deliberate purpose. It was because it was not the thing to do in a setting that was not really decentralized in the same way as the application of antitrust rules. So the departures are deliberate, but if you look into Article 38, you will see that all these exchanges of information between the national competition authorities and the commissions for the purposes of enforcing the DNA always count in the fact that the exchanges of information can also be used for the purposes of enforcing competition law. So this is foreseen. You have concretely the provisions in point 2 and in point 5, I think, that you can use that information. So that shouldn't be a problem. And then there is even a mentioning of the ECN in that article. I think that, as Alberto has mentioned, this has been working well. I would take issue a bit with the question of the independence and expertise. I think that the national competition authorities, and in particular after the ECN Plus directive, also have independence and expertise to give. I think that there is indeed the issue of jurisdiction that has been made by Alexandra, but on the other hand, the European Commission doesn't have jurisdiction over the whole world. And some of the decisions that come forward have a worldwide impact, obviously, because we are discussing platforms. So let's say the problem that you are seeing in national competition authorities taking that role exists for any competition authority in the world that would have taken that role. There will be also always a difference between the jurisdiction size and the spread and the consequences of what you are doing. It's just to be a bit controversial with you. But anyway, I mean, we accept things as they are, and we are going to be faithful supporters of the Commission in this, as in the rest of enforcement of competition rules. You wouldn't expect anything else from me. There was a point also on the contestability, whether it is more important the contestability or the fairness. I see, I mean, the contestability is all over, and it's something that speaks very much to somebody coming from competition. But I just want to say, without, you know, saying it is the one or it is the other, I just want to say that there are a lot of issues in Article 5 and 6 that relate actually to what you would consider exploitative conduct. And exploitative conduct is more about fairness, I would argue. So I think that there is scope for everything. Maybe you don't have the same amount. If you draw a list of things, maybe if you are just counting numbers, you don't have the same count for the one point or the other. But that doesn't mean that they are not important or that they are not as important. I think that they have their own, they have found their place in the DMA also, because it would be very difficult to obtain those results just with competition or with other means. You need regulation, precisely those. And then about the question of how to go about both applications. Of course, I was mentioning before Article 1.5 and Article 1.6. So indeed, if you are not discussing gatekeepers, or if you are discussing gatekeepers but not exactly the conduct that is covered by the DMA, you can apply other provisions. Or if the obligations that you are imposing are not the same ones as those obligations. But I fear that these kind of articles are articles that are going to be litigated. The moment other competition authorities within the network are going to be, using their mini DMAs to do this, I think that this is going to lead to litigation, and I'm not sure that goes in the best interest. Fostering these kind of dilemmas goes in the best interest of having a good enforcement of the DMA. But so that's the point I wanted to make about the parallel DMA. Of course, each member state can choose the ways they want to achieve the same results. But I would just think of something. Germany was in a way a leading authority in this regard, because they, before the DMA was there, they already had some legislation that somehow tackles the same things, and they should be honored for that. But I think that what they wanted to tackle with it was precisely these kind of companies. So I don't think that when that law was designed to tackle other possible gatekeepers that wouldn't be the big gatekeepers. And what would be the purpose of going after, let's say, more national, smaller platforms, to impose of them something that are, again, asymmetrical informations on top of obligations on top of the other asymmetrical obligations. I think that this is something that, people will have to rethink the usefulness of each of the instruments, but the DMA is not yet there. So the instruments that are still standing are useful in their own way, even to be applied to the current gatekeepers, and that includes competition enforcement, as I was mentioning before. So what I mean is that the landscape is more complex, and there is a time element and we will evolve. We will see what clicks and what doesn't click well in this enforcement. But I do think that, I don't see any reason why the competition authorities of the member states wouldn't be able to do the same as we have been doing now, and we will have some extra work. And a final word, because I think I fell short of, I wanted to entertain expectations, meaning that I am a competition person. I have done all my career competition, and by now I am old enough. But the authority I belong in the
do not say this today that is your birthday, okay? You're certainly not.
But anyway, thank you. But anyway, what I wanted to say is that in our cases, and in the cases of the regulator, the regulatory side of the CNMC, we have protocols for consultation. Of course, I don't discuss my investigations, early investigations with the regulator, the Chinese walls for this, but there is a moment where it is relevant to have their point of view. And it is also a moment for them to where our point of view is relevant. And these internal consultations we have, and we also have a wealth of data that you don't get immediately if you are not integrated in the same authority. So irrespective of the personal experience of each of us in our life, professional life, the fact is that the authority has a wealth of knowledge that comes from the fact that we are working together and that we have an overall council that sees both types of cases, even in two chambers. So I don't know if there was something else I should be addressing, because I got enthusiastic on some of the points, but if there is something I should have tackled and I didn't, please let me know.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And it's of course what you said is very correct. I mean, there is an added value in having more competencies in the same bodies and having the possibility to talk and seeing the same circumstances under a different perspective. And of course, a convergent body like CNMC or AGICOM for other aspects, it's very important, and could be very effective in tackling the market, all kinds of market issues. I will give the floor to Chiara now, and so she can complement the Marisa position on the governance, on the regulatory side, more RCEP side or BEREC sides. And also there is an interesting question in the question and answer about IP interconnection, which maybe Chiara is really the best place to answer. Also because in telecom, I mean, in telecom interconnection, so the telecom definition of interoperability is one of the basic and systemic remedies in order to internalize the externality, so having a pro-competitive effect, but also a general economic enhancement effect, because allow all customers to be able to communicate together, so enlarging the welfare that the sector is producing. So the interoperability, interconnection issues are very interesting and important issues. So Chiara?
Yes, thank you very much, Antonio. Yes, I would like to complement a bit the position then on the governance, because we discussed a lot the cooperation between the Commission and then competition authorities. And of course, there is also another part of the governance architecture of the DMA, which includes other competent authorities as well. And so first of all, from the point of view of the regulators, as it was mentioned by Alexander as well, I think we really very much welcome the point about this centralized organization and the fact that it is the European Commission at the EU level who is enforcing the DMA. We think that it is the best level actually of enforcement when you have this very transnational companies by definition, and with problems which are in any way present in different markets in different countries. And so the European level is the good one. And what we very much welcome is also the final an article which was added in the final version of the DMA, which is about the setup of a high-level group of regulators, and this includes, it doesn't include national authorities, but it includes European bodies and European networks from different sectors. So it is a BEREC for telecom regulation, it is the European Data Protection Supervisor, the European Data Protection Board, European Competition Network that was mentioned before, consumer protection, and then ERGA for the audiovisual. So I think it is very interesting to see that in the discussion, in the trilogues at the the end, it was considered as very relevant to add this kind of expertise to support the European Commission. And there was a question before about if the Commission would have enough resources to tackle the interoperability obligations, for instance. And I think it is in this kind of framework when we start creating a group assisting the Commission with some more technical expertise. It's also a way to lighten a bit the burden on the resources of the European Commission, because there may be some expertise which can be actually shared with the Commission, and in this sense that BEREC is also working now. And another thing which is very interesting for this group, this high-level group, is that one of the mission is to assess whether there is interactions, interplay needed between the DMA and other regulations which are more sector-specific. And this is key, actually, for the example that also I mentioned before, which is interoperability for NICs, because in the European Electronic Communication Code, which is so the regulatory framework for electronic communication, there is an article which is Article 61.2, where we already have powers also to enforce interoperability measures for the very same services. It is under different circumstances, so the two systems are complementary, but it's also good for legal certainty that this complementarity between the two service frameworks, let's say, so the DMA and the European Electronic Communication Code, is ensured. So I think I mean, beyond the complementarity with competition law enforcement, there is also other sector-specific regulations which are touched by the DMA. And then the other question on it was on IP interconnection, on IEP peering. So it's quite far from the topic of the conference, so I will just give some reference rather than some thoughts on this, or give just some insights. So the IP interconnection practices of the ISPs, so the internet service providers, they are generally outside the scope of the electronic communication regulatory framework, and they are largely unregulated. But an interesting case that may be interesting for the person who asked the question is the example of South Korea, because the legislature changed a bit the wholesale charging mechanism, introduced a mandatory sending party network pays framework. So a regulated tariff for IP interconnection. And if you are interested about, I mean, like a case study, and you may want to check what happened there and how the market was affected, because it also gives some insights on this. So the South Korean case could be interesting. And on this market of IP interconnection, I can share a bit the experience in France, which is quite peculiar compared to other countries in Europe, because we have a dispute resolution mechanism in our country. If a party thinks that they did not have an agreement which was fair, or they want to raise any point to the regulators, we have this dispute resolution mechanisms, which was put in place in 2012 and has never been used so far. So just to give a feedback on this. And in France, we also feed our knowledge of the market of IP interconnection, because we published every year a very detailed publication concerning interconnection market, presenting all the amount of incoming volumes, the sources of the traffic, and some aggregated information also about the nature of these agreements. So what I can do, maybe I can share in the chat like the documents published by ARCEP, so the French regulators, and also by reports by BEREC. It dates back to 2017, but we are currently working in BEREC to do an update of this analysis on IP interconnection that can maybe be of interest. So you will have to wait until next year to see the results. So that in the meantime, I can share the last publication if it can be of interest.
Thank you very much, Chiara. It was very useful, very interesting, and also I think the IP interconnection issue is very interesting. Also, would be one of the point also that would be interesting for the future. And I will give you now the floor, because we are running out of time, and the organization is very stringent with the timing, and so I give the floor to Elisa. If she wants to answer. There is a question in the, I'm not sure if you have the possibility to read it, but there is a question and answer just addressed to you by Roberta Carlini. and basically say why do you think that it would be unfair to hold the platform responsible for information pollution? Or this is a question that maybe you could answer, or anyway any other points that you would like to briefly address.
Thank you, Antonio. If we are running out of time, it's also my fault. So
no.
As a form of punishment, I will be very, very short. No, of course, I will answer the question. Thank you, Roberta Carlini. No, you're absolutely right in saying that traditional media outlets are already regulated. What I meant is that platforms are indeed responsible. I just wanted to highlight that they are not the only actor to be blamed for information pollution, and I tried to do so in the context of a line of reasoning meant to highlight the mutual exploitation of publishers and platforms, though it is a non-symmetrical one. My point is just that there are examples of clickbait from historical newspapers as well, whereas platforms do not create content. Of course, they amplify the effect, but they do not create content, and the idea is that they are not the only one to be accounted for information disorder, to which traditional media contribute as well. And this was meant to highlight the importance of a holistic approach and of moving from the paradigm of consumer protection to consumer empowerment, also because paradoxically, there could be another dilemma here. Pluralism, the very plurality of voices is likely to increase the background noise, the quantity of information to be processed, and in so doing contributing to information disorder. But if consumers are able to select information content, to evaluate content, comparing, hierarchizing, organizing, well, they might be able to bring order where there is none. So that was my final point, highlighting the importance of media literacy as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisa. And since the scarcity of time now, I think we have to upgrade Alex for the final remarks. So you're not anymore a panelist, but you go to the final remarks, Alexander. So before giving you the floor for the final remarks, I would like to thank you, all the panelists, all the speakers, IIC and Augusto and Lynn, Roberto Viola for the keynote. And I think it was very interesting discussion. Of course, time is always short, and but there will be, of course, there are a lot of discussion about it, but there will be in the next months when the enforcement will start. There will be much more a pragmatic issue to look at with some evidence. So please, Alex, I will give you the final remarks if you have any some comments. So please.
Oh, thank you. No, I just wanted to say that the easiest part has been done regarding the DMA and the DSA, and that was to pass the law. Now, the most difficult part comes, and I think it's difficult because it's not only, adopting law or doing enforcement, it's changing culture. I think the Commission should change its culture in the sense that it should become a kind of regulatory authority with a lot of technologists, and that is new for the Commission. And the big tech will have to change their culture because they have evolved in an environment of permissionless innovation, where they were really protected from the law, and now they will have to evolve towards something of a compliance culture. So I think that's where I see the extremely difficulty. It requires on both sides of the market, if you want, a change of culture. And I think those kind of debate and also your academic contribution are very important in helping that kind of change of culture.
Okay, thank you. It was very concise, and well, you're totally right. This is one of the main challenges, and I think for my experience, and maybe Antonio can say also something about that as regulator. I mean, the culture of big tech platforms is already changing. I mean, I can remember 10 years ago that they were almost, it was difficult to talk to them. I mean, there was like, now they're engaging anyway, of course, but they've been engaging for years. But surely there is a cultural gap that something has to change, both on the market side, on the platforms, and also on the institution. So Antonio, maybe you can say a couple.
Yes. Just say goodbye. I agree with all of you. Thank you, everyone, for this. And probably we will have the third book on the early implementations. Let's go like that, no? DSA and DMA early implementation, and we will see how things will go on from different perspectives, including the organizational one. And there was another question from the audience, which is of course very interesting, that is saying, what would be the role of national courts and European courts in shaping the decisions? This is a totally different chapter that we will see in the evolution in the future. I agree with Antonio and Alexander finally on the changing of the culture, but still, we have to overcome, and now comes the crucial point. We have to overcome the fundamental asymmetric information we have on the platforms, mechanisms, some data, and so on and so forth, and also on understanding several effects, because this is a knowledge asymmetry that we need to overcome. And so we have now instruments to do that. It is true that platforms have different businesses. They are not all the same. When I was a regulator, some platforms were happily coming to discuss with us as regulators. Some other simply have no address. They do not have a telephone number to call. And so I think things are now changing. Now we have the rules. We have to remember that platforms are regulators, but private one. So the new challenge is today to build a public regulation that is open to all the stakeholders, and it's trying to respond and satisfy the new needs of citizens and all the other stakeholders. So we will see. Thank you, meanwhile, very much for being with us, and happy birthday to Marisa again, and thank you for being here today.
I just remember the Chatham House rule, which characterized this debate.
Yes, thanks, of course. See you soon then. Thanks, Augusto. Thanks all the IIC friends and all the people that stay with us for almost.
Berto, Marisa, Chiara.
Ciao a tutti.
Yes.
Grazie.
Ciao.
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 Grazie.
Thank you.
Bye.